All right. Good morning, everyone. We are going to have a look at why on earth. I'm going to say that. Why on earth? Why would a pasuk say something which means something completely different? What do I mean by that? I mean, this is the most misquoted, I won't say misunderstood, but it's the most misquoted verse ever where people understand it out of context as literal. We all know that our rabbinic tradition knows it to be not literal but metaphorical, and that it is not a life for a life or an eye for an eye. It really is a financial compensation. If that's true, then the biggest question we have to ask ourselves, what on earth is the Torah doing? Why teach it that way if that's got nothing to do with the meaning? Because as I said, it would, if you ask non-Jews, if you ask someone who has no idea about the Bible, and you ask them, and you say, "You want to get revenge? What verse would you use in the Bible or the Torah?" What would they say? An eye for an eye. That's what people would use. So if it's so fraught with challenges, why have it? That's my opening salvo. That's the question for today. I'm hoping that you like the answer that we get to. But with often with great questions, sometimes the strong question is often better than the answer I'm going to provide. But there you have it. I also want to forget to tell you this. I know that we like to have our people on YouTube Live, but we have one of our YouTube Live visitors right here in the room. You know, we have my mother-in-law visiting all the way from Israel, who had to come to the class. So there you go. Just a heads up there, because my mom, whenever she visits, she normally visits when I'm not giving parasha, because it's always during, it's always for the Chagim, so it's always a busy time, so we don't always have class. But there you go. My mother-in-law, aka Susie, is here. Savta Susie is here visiting, so we get to have her in class. So what we're going to do is have a look at these verses. So you'll see here in source number 1, in our parasha, is chapter 21, verse 23 to 25. It says as follows: Ve'im ason yiyeh, v'natata nefesh tachat nafesh. If something terrible will happen, then you will, the penalty shall be a life for a life. Ayin tachat ayin, an eye for an eye. Shein tachat shein, a tooth for a tooth. Yad tachat yad, a hand for a hand. Regel tachat ragel, a foot for a foot. Kiviyah tachat kiviyah, burn for a burn. Peta tachat pata, a wound for a wound. Chabura tachat chabura, a bruise for a bruise. So we read this, and it's very hard to take. It's very challenging to understand this in other words. So it's one of these where the most important lesson is there are things which, people say to you, oral tradition, that's a much later development. Or I don't need the oral Torah. What's the oral Torah ever done for me other than make my life miserable and more difficult? Here is where I would tell you there are two fundamental reasons where I would tell someone here is proof of the authenticity of the oral tradition of the Torah Sheba'al Peh, and why I know they were given side by side. Number one would be examples such as, and you will do as I have shown you, regarding how to wear tefillin, how to do shechita, how to do lots of things where we only know how to do them because clearly there was an oral tradition. You will do it as I showed you. How did I show you? It must have been God showed Moshe how to do it. There clearly was an oral tradition. But also these types of psukim, these types of verses, which are so struggling, which are so difficult to understand, that we require that oral tradition to explain them. This portion is this verse or this concept is also brought down later in Sefer Vayikra, and you see that in source number 2. It says, "Ve'ish ki yiten mum ba'amito." If a person maims another person, kasher asa, what he did, ken yaseh, so you shall do to him. Shever tachat shever, a break for a break. Ayin tachat ayin, an eye for an eye. Shein tachat shein, and a tooth for a tooth. Kasher yiten mum ba'adam, kain yinatain ba. The injury inflicted on a human being shall be inflicted in return. What he did to do, so you shall do to him. So you see here, this one's even more the what I would call the pshat, or what I would call how to understand the Torah if I did not have any Mesorah, no tradition, no Torah Shebaal Peh, and I said to fifth graders, what does this verse mean? They would say, someone punched you, you punched them back. Someone hit you, you hit them back. Someone did that, you do exactly the same. Now, we're going to see the derivation of how what sounds from reading it to be very much you take someone's eye, someone takes out your eye, you take out their eye. We're going to see how it developed into a financial situation. So let's have a look here at source number 3. It is the Gemara in Bava Kama, Pei Gimel Amud Bet. And what's interesting here about this Gemara is that the Mishnah is just legal law without the reasons, just plays, and often it will bring disagreements amongst the Tanaim, amongst the rabbis of the Mishnah, but it doesn't necessarily give out the reasons or any of the background information. It's very terse. And there in the Mishnah, it breaks down and explains that when someone hurts you, there is a way of getting remuneration, there's a way of figuring out how to do the compensation. And the Gemara asks, Amai ayin tachat ayin amar rachamana, ema ayin mamash. The Gemara asks, so let's have a look at the translation here. Why does the Mishnah take for granted the fact the one who caused injury is liable to pay compensation to the injured party? The Torah states, or Rachamana, the merciful one, states in the Torah, an eye for an eye. You might say that this means that the one who caused injury shall lose an actual eye rather than pay payment. So again, see that back in the text. Amai ayin tachat ayin amar Rachmana, ema ayin mamash. Why? So it was almost like this. Amai, stop, question mark, which is, what's the Amai going on? The Amai is going on the Mishnah, which you don't see because I didn't put it on your source. The Mishnah, the Gemara is attacking the Mishnah, and it's saying, how can it be that the Mishnah has explained that when someone does something to somebody else, that you then don't hurt them back physically? It's not someone, your brother punches you, so you you punch them back. There is a compensation here. So the Gemara says, Amai. The verse says, Ayin tacha ayin. It should be an ayin. It should be an eye. Why is the Mishnah trying to do gymnastics and trying to understand it? And the Gemara responds, Los al kadaitach, don't think like that. The Tanya that you taught in the Braita, Yachol simet eino mesame et eino kata et yado mekata et yado shiber raglo meshaber raglo. Don't think if someone blinds out his eye that you should blind out his eye. If someone cuts off your hand that you should cut off his hand. If he breaks your leg that you should break his leg. Don't think like that. Talmud lomar makeh adam umakeh behema. Ma makeh behema letashlumin. Af makeh adam letashlumin. Says the Gemara. Therefore, the verse states, one who strikes a person. And the verse also states, and one who strikes an animal, to teach you. Just as one who strikes an animal is liable to pay monetary compensation, so too one who strikes a person is liable to pay monetary compensation. So here we have, this is the first recorded source. Yes, we have it also in the Midrash and the Tanchuma, we have it in the Midrash Agadah, we have in a lot of those legal courts, but it's, again, very similar to the time of the Mishnah and Gemara. At that time period, the Tanaim and Amoraim are explaining this to tell us that this is what this really means, that these verses should not be understood literally. Rather, even though it looks very clearly to be literal, that you do physical punishment for physical wounding, the actuality is that we are a society that believes in monetary compensation for this damage. Rashi brings that same down. He says it in a slightly different formulation, but it's from the same work. He says there in source number 4, Ayin tachat ayin, sime ein chavera noten lo demei eino, kama shepachatu damav limkor bashuk, v'chein kulam, v'lo netilat eve mamash, kama shedarshu rabotenu beperek hachovel. If one blinded the eye of his fellow man, he has to pay him the value of his eye, i.e., he pays him how much his value would be diminished if he were to be sold as a slave in the markets. So let's say someone is worth, say there, I know it's a little strange now for us to understand this because we don't have slave markets, but let's say someone is worth $50 with 2 great eyes, and now that one eye is really badly damaged, he's now worth $40. So he would have to, that is how much he would be worth. So we'd say your compensation to the person would be $10, and that would be how it would work. And the Rashi continues and says, in the same way, all other cases are to be dealt with, but it does not mean the actual cutting off of the offender's limb, just as our rabbis have explained in the chapter beginning with the words Hachovel. Okay, that's the name of the chapter. So far, what we've been able to get to is we have verses in the Torah which mean, without any background, would mean to us very clearly, vigilante punishment. Someone cuts off your hand, you cut off their hand. Someone blinds your eye, you blind their eye. And the Gemara, which is then quoted by Rashi, and the Mishnah are all saying, no, you misunderstand. Our tradition is that means monetary. It doesn't mean physical punishment. Yeah. No, you're looking like
No.
your eyes are saying something.
No, I'm just thinking, like, what if the guy subsequently got an infection and died from his arm being cut off or his hand being cut off?
So that's a great question, which is, can you pay kofar? Can you pay that type of restitution for a ransom, as it were? Can you pay that for killing somebody? And that's where there's a difference. And if someone kills somebody, then monetary compensation is not the way to do it. But here, what we're saying is anything other than killing somebody, whether it's intentional or unintentional, whether it was premeditated or unpremeditated, take away killing someone is a whole different story, and that's one which we could spend a long time trying to get into, which is, in classic, there seems to be a really a derivation and development here when it comes to murder. What the intent was and what the punishment is very different in Western society to what it was and so there's been a bit of a change through even in the period of the Talmud, going through what would be the punishments for an unintentional murderer versus an intentional murderer. Yes, in the Torah we have the concept of going to an ir miklat for the unintentional murderer, but we also have there's the rodef. There's all these other pieces going on. So there's a little bit more complicated for our shiur, where we're dealing with just you did everything up to killing someone, whether it was intent or not, and the person can still live. and they won't die from their wounds. That one has to make a monetary compensation. That's what we're learning. What we're trying to understand is, where does that come from? Is that something which the rabbis, I don't say, I want to say, and Esther, I want to take your question in a second. I want to say what the elephant in the room is. The elephant in the room is, did the rabbis soften the Torah shebichtav? Did the rabbis come later and say, you know what, this sounds really barbaric, so we're going to really reinterpret it to make us feel a little bit better? And the answer is, it sounds like that. I was going to say it does sound like that, because the midrashic material that we have is quite a lot later. So you could say perhaps there's a softening here of the writing. And what I'm trying to, my goal of this morning, other than teaching Torah just for the sake of loving Torah, is to really explain, yes, it may have been codified in the Mishnah and the Gemara hundreds of years later, but this notion of the Mesorah, of the Oral Torah, of the Torah Shebaal Peh, is much, much older than what was codified by the rabbis, whether in Midrash or Mishnah or Gemara. It's a much older thing, and we're going to see that explicitly in the Rambam, and we're going to see that in source number 5. But before we do that, I want to hear from Esther.
Well, actually, I think you answered my question, because I was going to ask, isn't the Gemara Torah Shebaal Peh? And so the question that I was thinking is, why is this different than any other thing that was not explained specifically in the Torah Shebichsav? But then the Gemara went on to explain, tefillin or kashrus or any other thing that we need further explanation, and we look to the Torah Shebaal Peh, the Gemara, for. But what you're saying is this was preceded.
Right. Well, what I guess the question I'm asking, which is, you get a lot of people telling me, if you just gave me the Torah itself and the Pshat and everything which I can understand, I'm okay with that. There's a feeling, again, I'm not saying it's emet, but there's a feeling which is, the rabbis just added and added, and those additions were not. They came much later, and they don't have the same legitimacy. And my goal is always to try to express, whether you enjoy something about Judaism or you don't, the notion that something is a much later man-made invention challenges the entire authenticity of Torah, not just the Torah Shebaal Peh, but it also attacks the authenticity of the Torah Shebichtav, because I could say, well, why is the written Torah true? Maybe Moshe, God forbid, maybe Moshe wrote that rather than he was dictating what Hashem told him. So one of the goals of trying to do this is to express, which is, something can be codified, something can be written centuries later. But this understanding is going to come here, and the Rambam is going to explain to us, and we're going to do it. And it's one of those, it's really critical to get over. And I think a lot of people, struggle with this, and they say, you know what, I'm still going to be a firm Jew. I'm still going to be Shomer Shabbat and Shomer Kashrut, but there's something which ebbs, which is not ebbs, something which is niggling at me deep down. I'm wondering, did the rabbis make that up? God forbid. Did the rabbi, who gave, what I'm trying to say is, if we can establish the Torah Shebaal Peh and the explanations going on was all there at Sinai, and then things are developing, don't get me wrong, the rabbis are coming up with chidushim 1,000 years later, 2,000 years later, whatever it might be, but the system, the fact that Moshe was told at Sinai, there are some things which are what's known as halacha leMoshe miSinai. They were given to Moshe at Sinai, and they're not, everything came after the destruction of the second Beit HaMikdash. This was all post, sacrifices. This is all post the Kohanim. This is just the rabbis came in and they kind of like doctored Judaism and came up with the Torah Shebaal Peh. And now, instead of Kohanim being in charge, the rabbis are in charge. And instead of saying everything revolves around korbanot, now everything revolves around biblical exegesis, what we call parshanut. And this is that whole question, which is whether this keeps you up at night or doesn't. There is something, and maybe it's something which bothers people who are more my age or not, but there's always something going on, which is, when did the rabbis come up with that? Did they, was that something, we all know, for example, eating chicken and cheese is rabbinic in nature. And the reason why we don't eat chicken, those who don't eat meat, those who do eat meat, sorry, Susie, but for those of us who are, those who we meet, we know that chicken and cheese aren't eaten together, not because there's a biblical prohibition there. Our rabbis wanted to safeguard that. We also know, even at that time, there were different rabbis. For example, Rabbi Yossi Haglili, who had the minhag in his town, his community, did not have that safeguard of chicken and cheese, and they did eat chicken, not chicken Kiev, but they probably had what was akin to chicken Kiev in their town, and it became the halacha, ubiquitous for all communities, Ashkenazic and Sephardic, to not eat chicken and cheese, and to treat chicken and cheese the same way as we would treat red meat with any dairy products. That one, we can see that that's a safeguard protector, which came later on in time. What I'm trying to say is, here, it's very important to understand this notion of monetary compensation, where the verse definitely, not implied, that is exactly what the Torah is saying. Who gives them the right to do that if they're making that change hundreds of years later? My answer, this isn't a softening hundreds of years later. This is a halacha l'Moshe Sinai. There are certain things which we learned from many, many years ago. For example, there are things which are halacha l'Moshe Sinai which we don't really argue about. For example, how to wear your tefillin, the fact that they are black, the fact that we have strap, all those types of things. You might argue on the orders of the batim between Rashi and Rabbeinu Tam, tefillin, for example, but tefillin are like that. We aren't big machlokot on how to do shechita. Okay, there are other machlokot around it, but the basic how to do shechita, how to do ritual slaughter, is one way. Why? Because these are things which are known as halacha l'Moshe Sinai. They were given to Moshe at Sinai, and so not only were they given at Sinai, but the ability for rabbis later on to then add. They're not adding in thin air. They're adding as they're going along, but that tradition of the Moshe was also given not only a written Torah by HaKadosh Baruch Hu, but he was also explained to him, and all the way back there that what was given to you was also, you knew then that it was a monetary meaning, even if the rest of the known world had this phraseology, and we're using it very differently. For example, it's called the Hammurabi Code. They also have these phrases, and they did take it literally. Judaism may have used the same language, but meant it very differently. So we'll see here. Let's have a look at source number 5, and look at the Rambam, and hopefully what I'm trying to say will become a little bit clearer. It says here the Rambam, Uminayin how do we know that regarding limbs, where it says ayin tachat ayin, tashlu minhu, that it is, when it says an eye for an eye, that it really is a payment? Shene'emar ba chabura tachat chabura. And regarding it, it also says a wound for a wound. So how do I know that it's going to be financial compensation? In regard to the penalty for giving a person a blow, it explicitly states, another verse, it says, V'chi yakeh ish et re'ehu be'even or be'egrof. And then it continues, rak shivto yiten v'rapo yirapeh. When a man strikes his friend with a stone or he punches him, he should pay for his being idle and for his medical expense. He has to pay for his time off work, and he has to pay for the medical bills. Thus, we learn there, says here, halamadata shetachat shene'emar b'chabura tashlumin. There, the word for a blow, where it says tachat, there we understand the word tachat there to mean financial compensation. And so one can conclude that the meaning of the same word regard to an eye or another limb is also financial constitution. It says here, let's see that back again inside in the text. Halamadata shetachat shene'emar b'chabura tashlumin. That word tachat, we said ayin tachat ayin, an eye for an eye. That word for, F-O-R, in the Hebrew is the word is tachat. There, regarding a blow or a punch, we say there it really is a compensation. How do we know that? Because it says there, it says there when someone strikes you, you have to pay for his time of work, his shevet, and you will surely heal him. And you have to pay for his medical bills. V'hu so therefore the same is true, letachat ta'amor ba'ayin v'shai barim. So the same law applies with the word tachat in other cases. As I'm going to say, if the word tachat here means financial restitution, then it means financial restitution every time that word ayin, that word tachat is used. So it means that where it says ayin tachat ayin, shein tachat shein, yad tachat yad, regel tachat ragel, because that's how we understand it. Then the Rambam says, and here's where it's really important, v'afal pi shedavrim elu nir'im me'inyan Torah shebichtav, v'kulan mefarashin hen mipi Moshe Rabbeinu mehar Sinai, kulan halacha leMoshe hein biyadenu v'chazer ra'u avotenu danin bebeit dino shel Yehoshua ubeit dino shel Shemuel haramati ubechol beit din ubeit din she'amdu miyamot Moshe Rabbeinu ad achshav. Says the Rambam in Halacha number 6, something very, very important. He's going to very succinctly explain to me the halachic system all the way from Moshe Rabbeinu into our time, and every Beit Din that has ever applied this rule. Whether we have, since we only have the Mishnah and the Gemara where it codifies it, it's telling you it's codified in the Mishnah and Gemara centuries later. But it was always learned and always studied and always, most importantly, always practiced as monetary. He says, although these interpretations are obvious from the study of the written law, and they are explicitly mentioned in the oral tradition transmitted by Moshe from Har Sinai, they are all regarded as halachot leMoshe miSinai. They're all laws straight from Moshe, which he received at Sinai. This is what our ancestors saw in the court of Joshua and in the court of Shemuel of Ramah, and in every single Jewish court that has functioned from the days of Moshe, our teacher, until the present day. So what the Rambam is saying is, I'm bothered by the same question that Ben Hassan has 800 years later. What's his question? His question, which he's struggling, is, I don't see any text explaining financial compensation until the Mishnah. Where'd they get it from? Answers the Rambam, I hear your pain. And here's my answer for you. This was handed down from Hashem to Moshe, to Yehoshua, to Shemuel, and throughout until the present Beit Din. Every Beit Din for 3,300 years has always done financial restitution, when they've done compensation whenever someone has been hurt, whether by accident or whether deliberate. Now, this does not answer My bigger question, which I asked right at the beginning of class, which is, well, thank you for this gymnastics for the last half hour, where we will agree it's halacha Moshe Sinai. Some of you might still not yet be convinced totally. We understand that all this came from Sinai, but why? Why didn't Hashem just tell Moshe, when someone wounds you, you have to make a financial restitution. You have to pay compensation. Why create such an ambiguous term? Why make it so hard? Why make it that it looks like the rabbi softened it centuries later? Why does the Rambam need to tell you this is how every Beit Din has practiced it from the time from Moshe Rabbeinu until Bisman Hazeh? Why doesn't it need to do that? So the Rambam answers that in our final source today, in source number 6. And he says as follows: that which it says in the Torah, this time in Vayikra 24:20, Kasher yiten mum ba'adam ken yinaten ba, just as he caused an injury to his fellow, so too an injury should be caused to him. That is the most egregious of all the verses that we saw. Okay, that's the worst. That one says it in black and white. Just as he hurt you, you hurt him. He gave you a black eye, you give him a black eye. Says the Rambam, should not be interpreted in a literal sense. It does not mean that the person who caused the injury should actually be subjected to a similar physical punishment. Ella, rather, what's the case? And here I bolded it. Shehu ra'ui lechasero eva o lechavol bo kasher asa ulefichach meshalem nizkar. Rather, the intent is what? Why do I have to have this ambiguous language, which even leans towards actual punishment? The intent is that he deserves, the perpetrator deserves to lose a limb or to be injured in the same manner as his friend was. And therefore, he should make financial restitution to him. Says the Rambam, if the Torah didn't use the language of ayin tachat ayin, I never would have understood the severity. I never would have realized, strictly speaking, if Hashem was punishing, it is an eye for an eye. It's really what you deserve. And in order to get over that, I'm going to use that language, even though it gives me the ambiguity of what it actually means. We know there's no problem because we've had Batei Din, because we've had all these law courts from the time of Moshe who've always shown it to be monetary compensation. Indeed, there's a slightly a similar train of thought from the Ibn Ezra and the Ramban, which is, it's very difficult, Ramban with an N, Nachmanides, with a Nun, it's very difficult to actually do what someone did to you. Now, let's say someone, knocked out your tooth. You can say, okay, fine, I could knock out someone's tooth. But what happens if someone hurt you or you lost partial vision? How do you strike someone to give that other person that same partial vision? There's no way of doing it. So only Hashem can really punish people. So it says, if we had to say, if Hashem was doing it, it was you're chayav bidei shamayim, you're obligated to upstairs. Hashem can make those types of calculations and make sure that exactly what happened to what you did will happen to you. But we're flesh and blood, we can't do it. But take that interpretation out. The Rambam is trying to tell us, if I wrote it in an unambiguous way and said, you will pay the monetary value for hurting your friend, whether it's an eye, whether it's a leg, whether it's a hand, whether it's a wound, I just say, okay, how much did I do you? I get my checkbook out, take care of it, move on. This is telling you whether it's, yes, there's another punishment for murder, but it's also, there's a punishment, and then we should have severity regarding limbs. It's all part of our Tzelem Elokim, and we have to be very careful with it.
Okay, what kind of bothers me is that it's monetary restitution, and I'm going, what if the guy's really wealthy? like, oh, who cares? I write my check for $50 or whatever, and I'm done. It doesn't hurt me.
And that's why the Rambam is coming out to tell you that if I am wealthy, especially now that we live in such a, I'm not saying that no one struggles financially, but we live in a far more, wealthy society. Someone could just say, fine, exactly right. I'm going to get my checkbook out. That's why the verse is saying, ayin tacha ayin. You try and hurt someone who you think is lowly, you think has no money, has nothing. And it's like, no, you took an eye from a human being who's created Sam Elohim. And you're really going to figure it out exactly what. The Rambam also discusses, by the way, the notion that not everyone's eyes are the same. Perhaps someone is a jeweler and he is trying to identify exactly, versus, someone has to use their eyes for something really, really precise, and someone else may not. So you can't say taking out the eye will do that. But it's trying to say here, which is, yes, we have to safeguard against the brigand basically saying I can do what I want because I have the money for it, and I'm going to write the check for whatever damage I do. And so the Torah was to tell you can, but here's the musar: it's ayin tacha ayin, it's nefesh tacha nefesh. These are human beings. We're all human beings. We're all tzelem elokim, and we have to make sure we don't forget that. So you can still have that issue, and I think that's still something we're still struggling with today, which is, if I have all the money in the world, does that mean I can do whatever I want, or do I still have morals and compunction, and where I have to actually follow what's necessary? Sorry.
I think it's so interesting because it's exactly how Hashem made us, and He knows how He made us. So He put this safeguard into the Torah to help us to understand, this is how I made you. You are going to, deny, you're going to not take responsibility, you're going to demean, you're going to, do all these gymnastics so that you don't understand the seriousness of this. So I'm going to make sure you understand, because this is how I made you. I put this in you. I made you vulnerable. I made you frail. I made you human. And I'm going to help you to understand, to connect
Exactly
how
right.
important this is. So it's like the refuah before the makkah, or, how they say that. It reminds me of the story of Rabbi, I think it was Aryeh Levin, who took his wife to the doctor and says, my wife's foot hurts us.
I've heard Arthur tell us that one. It's a good story. Yeah.
It's like, this is how we need to feel. We need to feel the hurt. We don't just need to think about the compensation. We need to understand what it means to the person that we did that.
And that's beautiful.
Good.
Yeah. And Susie.
Were there any Rebbeim who had a dissenting opinion about this?
So great question. So that's another great proof how we know that it's Torah Misinai, because they may argue how to do the compensation, but they don't argue on the fact that compensation is necessary. So great point. That's another wonderful idea, which is, no, the rabbis don't argue on whether there should be compensation. They just argue on, is it all categories, is it all times? And that's you can learn Bava Kama till you blew in the face to see all the, or at least Perka Chovel, so you can get into all of that. But what I wanted to show you today is Harambam is writing Mishnah Torah. I didn't bring you a Musar or Machshava book here. This wasn't ethics. This was Jewish law. And Jewish law, the Rambam is taking his time to tell us, you may have doubts about oral tradition. I'm going to talk about that. You may have doubts about why the Torah frames itself the way it does. And I'm going to answer that too, because those are important to me, because I want you to understand that we're all created with Tzelem Elokim. We all have questions, and those questions are all worthy of being answered. It's not a question of, oh, that's such a disrespectful question, I'm not going to answer it. That's a legitimate question. It does look like the Torah has been softened by the rabbis. It looks like a rabbinic invention. And guess what? It's a good question. but it's not. And here's how I know it's not. And I'm going to explain to you why it's not. And I'm also going to answer that question of, well, why leave it ambiguous? Just say, if you hurt someone, you pay them what you do, you hurt them. Because that doesn't show that person that we're all human beings and we can't just do what we want and say, here's our checkbook. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you.
All right, guys, I'm sorry.